Love Everlasting, a Regency romance by Lysa Shimkus. My God, it hasn't changed one bit. Arthur Phillip stared out the coach as he drew closer and closer to Penhaven, his family estate in Derbyshire. Looming into view was a stone-faced Georgian mansion that regarded him with a bleak, austere severity that chilled any hope of a warm welcome. It was a place Arthur had not called home since he was 15 and sent away to learn the ways of a clergyman. As the second son of an earl, Arthur was destined for such a life. 2 weeks prior, now at the ripe age of 25, he had been summoned by his father due to private family matters. Arthur had assumed the earl was dying and wished to see his second son one last time. Upon entering the mansion, Arthur was steered away from his father's chambers and into the library. The air in the room was a mix of stale tobacco and dry, aged paper. His father, who still preferred his wig of the old days, and his red regimental outfit that now struggled to hold itself together around his middle, looked up from his ledgers and squinted at Arthur. "What now, Henry?" he inquired, irritation in his voice. "Am I to settle more of your debts?" The housekeeper bowed to Arthur and quietly left the library. Arthur cleared his throat, unsure of how to speak to the man he hadn't spoken to nor seen in 10 years. "Well, spill it out, my boy," the Earl continued, his eyes back on his work. "I'm a busy man." "It is I, Arthur, my lord," the clergyman corrected. His father froze before looking up, his white brows furrowing together. As he studied the boy who was now a man, Arthur couldn't help noticing that his father's once piercing blue eyes were now lighter in color. The bags beneath such eyes, and the lines on his face, were more pronounced as well. "Arthur," the Earl whispered, as if he were seeing a ghost. Arthur straightened. "Yes, father. I received your urgent news and came as soon as I could." The Earl quickly moved from his desk, and in the process sent his papers flying about. "Arthur," he repeated, stumbling into the young man's arms. Arthur caught his father, who cupped his jaw in both hands and peered at him intensely with those light blue eyes. "Yes, father, it is I," Arthur assured him. He expected the old man to rebuke him, to scold him for disappearing for 10 years, but the old man burst into tears instead. Shocked, Arthur just stood there, as his father cried. The old man's wails reminded Arthur of the day he was sent away to Downton in Wiltshire. He had begged to remain, even clung to his mother's skirts, but he was thrust into the carriage and driven off the estate like a sack of unwanted potatoes. For the next 5 years, his mother wrote diligently, relaying information on the family estate and how his father and older brother were faring. And then the letters stopped coming. "Your mother," the Earl whimpered. "She left us. She left this earth." That Arthur knew. "I cannot go on without her." As the Earl clung to him, with a shaking body, all the young man could do was pat his father's back. It was unlike the Earl to show emotions and plead for help and forgiveness. "You have me now, father," Arthur spoke as gently as possible, although his voice sounded rather stiff and forced. "Thank you, my boy. Thank you for coming home." Home. The word sounded so foreign to this second son of the Earl, who had been banished from the estate over something trivial. Elizabeth Townsend wrung out her hand after setting down her pen. She spent the entirety of the morning writing correspondences. She wrote to Mrs. Thorne, graciously thanking the older woman for the volumes of poetry and philosophy gifted from her late husband's library. She wrote to several neighbors, asking that they call again, and to the many suitors whose gifts and flowers decorated every inch of the London townhouse. Yet none brought her joy. Elizabeth spent the past 10 years learning the ways of the gentry. As the second daughter of a merchant and the only unmarried one left, she was expected to fit in and marry up in society. Yet her heart longed for more. It longed for the presence of a boy who once raced around the 2 adjoining family estates with her, or rather, the estate her father purchased with his growth in trade and the Penhaven family estate adjoining theirs. And next door was Arthur Phillips, an invisible child much like herself. While Elizabeth's sisters took to learning etiquette and flirting with boys young, Elizabeth read tales about knights and dragons, she climbed trees and swung swords, and she was free to be herself around Arthur. What started as innocent child's play grew into something more with time. It turned into love. "Miss Elizabeth, you haven't changed into your walking clothes," came a voice from behind her. Elizabeth started and turned to greet a maid, a young girl, really standing by her bedside. "Why, Mary?" she asked the girl. "For your walk with Lord Silas this afternoon, miss." Elizabeth had forgotten that she had agreed to a walk around Hyde Park with Lord Silas. It was her mother's idea, truly. After Elizabeth's 3 sisters, 1 older and 2 younger, secured great matches, her mother decided it was Elizabeth's turn to marry. Now 23, Elizabeth had accepted spinsterhood. Her father had noted that her dowry could be hers after her 25th birthday. She only needed to play charades for another 2 years. "Right. Please give me a hand, Mary." Elizabeth was soon dressed and escorted to Hyde Park with her mother as chaperone. Lord Silas was prompt, as usual. He was a rather tall and thin man, with greying hair on the sides of his head and face. His first 2 wives had died young, and the Baron was in need of a 3rd wife. Elizabeth always knew her prospects were limited, yet she never thought her parents would force her into considering a widower. Although Lord Silas was only in his early 40s. "Once he dies, all his wealth will go to you," her father had said. "I cannot inherit his property without an heir," Elizabeth had corrected, "and Lord Silas already has 5. Elizabeth could only imagine that the Baron needed yet another mother for his 5 children, all of whom were still young. The walk around Hyde Park was uneventful and mundane. They spoke of the weather and sports, which Elizabeth was not interested in. And they admired the other promenaders. After the hour, Elizabeth graciously thanked the Baron for his invitation and returned to the family's townhouse. "You did not invite him to dine with us," her mother muttered. "I have no appetite, Mamma," Elizabeth said, which was truthful. She considered how many days she could go without food. Death, at this point, felt more welcoming than agreeing to a fake courtship. "What am I to do with you?" Mamma inquired. 5 suitors and yet you take to none." "Perhaps it's just London," Elizabeth teased, "where the men smell of tobacco and horse manure. And all they can speak of is the clouds and their gambling tables." "Nonsense," said her mother. "I've never heard them speak of gambling once." "Yet you agree on the odor." Mother and daughter returned to the family townhome, where they were greeted by a letter from Papa. He had returned to the family estate earlier in the week and brought news. The Phillips, their neighbors, were throwing a ball to recognize the return of their son Arthur. Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest like that of galloping horses. Arthur had returned at last. The boy who once stole her heart still held it firmly. Arthur had expected to remain at Penhaven for just a week, yet his father insisted he stay for a month or 2. "We are to give a ball," the Earl stated. "Our friends and neighbors will be thrilled to know you have returned." "Father, you forget that I am not here to stay," Arthur noted. "I have a parsonage in Wiltshire. I must return to my duties." "You shall, but after this ball." Arthur was certain his father wished for him to find a wife. Yet there was only one person Arthur could ever wish to marry, and he was certain she was now a married woman. Just one ball, Arthur told himself. One ball, and he could return to his quiet village and cottage. On the night of the ball, Arthur was adjusting his navy blue attire for the umpteenth time when a knock came at the door. Before he could answer, the door swung open and Arthur was greeted by a man much like himself. Henry was tall and broad, with blonde curls and handsome features. "Arthur, home at last," Henry slurred, inviting himself into the space. He stumbled into a nearby chair and slumped down into the cushion. Arthur stared at his older brother. The heir to the throne was once a charming heartthrob who enjoyed parties and women. Arthur could see his brother had changed little, aside from his drinking. "Where have you been?" Arthur asked, fixing his cravat and straightening his waistcoat. "I've been here a month now." "Busy," Henry admitted. "You know how things are. Managing a large estate is not easy. I do believe Father's been managing without you." Arthur knew his brother was telling a falsehood. "Yes, he manages the land and our tenants. But do you know who he sends to London? Who has to show face to the ton? Do you actually get work done in London?" Or do you merely attend parties and invite women to your bed? News of Henry made it to Wiltshire, where Arthur wished neither were related. Henry didn't speak. After a long awkward silence mingled among them, Henry finally said, "Miss Elizabeth, no, she's Miss Townsend now, is in London." "Have you heard all her sisters are married except for her?" Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Elizabeth, the daughter of a merchant on the neighbouring estate, his childhood best friend, was still unwed. "I tried pursuing her," Henry admitted. Arthur glared at his brother as his jaw tightened and his hands fisted. He wished to place his hands on Henry and toss him from the room. Or worse, down the stairs. The man was too drunk to think correctly nor fight back. But such an act was against a clergyman. "You lie," he said instead. "Would I ever?" Henry looked up at him, but his eyes could not stay on Arthur. "Lady Elizabeth is not that innocent young girl you once knew, Arthur. No, she is tall and rather beautiful. I admit I was smitten by her once and what? Well, I can't remember the rest. I woke up on the pavement. My lovely ladies of the night and neighbours were gathered around me." Arthur snickered to himself. He had a feeling Henry tried to make a move on Elizabeth, and the women threw him off of her. Elizabeth had always been strong and unladylike. Yet what kind of woman was she now? "She never married," Henry continued. "I do believe she is waiting for you." Arthur's chest warmed at the thought. Just then he realized his brother was not dressed for tonight's ball. When he inquired if Henry would be joining them, the other man only said, "I would love to, you know I would, but I have prior obligations to attend to." Yet another falsehood. However, this meant Henry would not be interfering. The other man always garnered attention for himself, as much as he could claim. The door to Arthur's room opened once more, and this time it was the Earl standing at the threshold. At the sight of Henry, the other man only said, "Get out, you. He waved the eldest son out of the room. Once alone, the Earl shut the door and turned to face his second son. "My boy," he began in a rather shaky voice. "I have a request to make." At these words, Arthur's chest tightened and his ears began to ring. The last time his father spoke such words, he had Arthur promise never to see Elizabeth again. When Arthur refused, he found himself bound for Wiltshire. Before Arthur could utter a sound, the Earl said, "I promised all the mothers in town that their daughters may share a dance with you tonight." A sigh escaped Arthur. "A dance," he said. "Nothing more, father." "Nothing more," the Earl repeated. Elizabeth could barely contain her excitement as the family carriage drove up the long drive of Penhaven. It felt like forever since Elizabeth last stepped onto the property. She had had no need to be here, not since Arthur left the county without a word. She had hoped to see him in London, but it was only Henry. The older brother always disgusted her. Would he be here tonight? "Do stop fidgeting," Mamma scolded from next to her. "I can't help myself," Elizabeth admitted, plastering her face to the carriage window. "Besides, do you want me here or not? I can always return home and to Papa's library." Mamma didn't speak a word. Ever since her last sister married, Elizabeth gained the upper hand at home. She was no longer invisible and rather a prized possession to her mother, who wished to show off her last trophy to any man of wealth. When their carriage stopped before the front steps of Penhaven, Papa descended and helped his wife. Elizabeth was aided by the footman and led herself up the steps after Mamma and Papa. Her heart danced in her ears as Elizabeth took in the familiar sights and sounds of Penhaven. It was as if time hadn't moved in the grand house. When they entered the grand ballroom, Elizabeth's eyes darted about, eager to find just one face. And he was not hard to miss, for Arthur Phillips was still as tall and handsome as ever. The boy she once loved now had more mature features and a strong and sturdy build. His green eyes found hers, and the sights and sounds around Elizabeth suddenly evaporated away like morning dew. Her heart stammered in her chest as he slowly approached her. Only once he spoke did Elizabeth's hearing return. "Mr. and Mrs. Townsend, welcome to Penhaven," Arthur greeted her parents. And to Elizabeth, he murmured, "Miss Townsend." He took her delicate hand in his, raised it to his lips and pressed a soft kiss onto her knuckles. Elizabeth longed to lunge herself into Arthur's arms and embrace him, but that would not be ladylike. Instead, she curtsied and said, "Mr. Phillips, how pleasant to know you have returned to Derbyshire. Will you be staying long?" There was a slight twitch in his eyes, as Arthur said, "I'm afraid not. The clergy needs me." Elizabeth felt her heart sink into her stomach. "I see. However, if you do not object, may I secure this next dance?" That boyish charm and allure lingered on his handsome face, and Elizabeth could not refuse. Although the dance floor did not allow for much conversation, it did allow for speculation. Elizabeth could feel all eyes on her and Arthur, including those of her parents and the Earl. In the past, such eyes were cold, stern, and scrutinizing. At present Elizabeth could not read their intentions. "You're rather quiet tonight, Miss Townsend," Arthur whispered as he passed her on the dance and returned to his line. "I admit I'm rather speechless," Elizabeth said, taking her step toward him. "Can I inquire as to why?" "Because you're back." Arthur only snickered at her, and Elizabeth didn't know whether to punch his arm or pull him into a kiss. A kiss! She spent the past 10 years dreaming of what it would feel like to kiss the second son of the Earl, the boy man she was still in love with. The dance came to what felt like a premature halt, and Arthur led Elizabeth back to her parents, who pretended they had not been watching the dance. Elizabeth spent the rest of the night hoping Arthur would ask her for a second dance, but he never did. It slowly began to dawn on her that in the 10 years they spent apart, Arthur may no longer be in love with her. Several times she had to blink back tears, as she watched the boy of her childhood share a dance with what felt like every girl in the town. Not once did his eyes seek hers. It's possible, Elizabeth told herself, Arthur already gave his heart to a woman in Wiltshire. He did say, after all, that he needed to return to the clergy. Elizabeth suddenly felt foolish. She spent the past 10 years waiting for a boy who had transformed into a handsome man, forgetting that somewhere along their separate paths he may have found someone new. Turning to her mother, Elizabeth inquired when they would be leaving. "After dinner," said Mamma. Dinner seemed a distant prospect. Elizabeth needed to leave now. With her heart now hammering in her chest once again, and tears building behind her eyes, Elizabeth quickly excused herself. There was very little space for privacy, with guests in every nook or cranny Elizabeth could find. Finally, she took to the patio and descended toward the gardens. The gardens of Penhaven have transformed little since Elizabeth was last here, even in the moonlight. She could still make out the beds of roses and sweet peas. And she could hear their childhood cries and laughter as she and a young Arthur pranced around the two family estates. They were so naive and free then, with zero family obligations to weigh them down. At present, both were expected to be mature and fulfill family duties. As the second son of an earl, Arthur would have to marry a woman of old money, and Elizabeth would have to elevate herself in society through suitors no other woman wanted. Elizabeth wiped at her cheeks just as her name rang across the gardens. She turned to find Arthur rushing down the back steps toward her. "Elizabeth, you're not leaving, are you?" he asked, his breath coming fast from the brisk walk. "Elizabeth." He used her name as if they were still carefree children. She only shook her head and gave a small smile. Arthur's face contorted then, as his eyebrows furrowed. "You're crying. Are you hurt?" His hands immediately cupped her face, as his thumbs wiped at her cheeks, and Elizabeth found her facade crumbling. Her vision blurred and throat constricted, as Elizabeth cried the way she had all those years ago when she learned that Arthur had left without a farewell nor explanation. He pulled her into his arms and squeezed her tightly, and Elizabeth clung to Arthur, afraid to let him go. She did not want him to abandon her again. Only after Arthur's racing heartbeat slowed to a rhythmic melody in her ear, which was pressed against his chest, did Elizabeth pull away. Even so, Arthur held her hands in his grasp. "Oh, Arthur, you know not how often I've dreamed of this moment," Elizabeth confessed. "I've missed you. But surely you cannot miss me. There are so many." Arthur chuckled. "Why can't I miss you? Am I not allowed to? You left so suddenly. You didn't even say goodbye. Because I couldn't. Elizabeth studied her companion's face, searching for some form of tease or taunt. Instead, she was met with pained eyes that carried a slight sheen to them. Whatever do you mean? She inquired. Arthur breathed deeply before confessing that all those years ago, he had been pulled into his father's study and told to cease contacting Elizabeth. The Earl forbade him to mingle with new money, and it was about time Arthur caught a girl who also came from a long line of rightful inheritance. When Arthur confessed he loved Elizabeth and vowed to marry her one day, the Earl had him sent away from Penhaven. It was all so sudden, Arthur said, his hand suddenly cold in Elizabeth's. All planned and executed without my knowledge. I was sent to Downton, where my uncle Arthur was awaiting my arrival. When he learned that my being there was not my choosing, my uncle offered to return me to Penhaven. But I had to refuse him, Elizabeth. Arthur peered deeply into her eyes. My father would disinherit me had I returned. Then what was I to do? I would have had no home to return to. Elizabeth took her hands from Arthur's and touched his face. He felt so warm and rough against her touch. You could have come to live with me, she said. I'm sure Mama and Papa would have welcomed you. Arthur shook his head. Not in that way, Elizabeth. If I am ever to live with you, it would be to serve as your husband. Elizabeth's chest went cold at his words, and she took a step back. But we can never be, she recalled, tears filling her eyes once more. That's why you were sent away. You were sent away because you love me, a merchant's daughter. Arthur took a step forward. I do not care, Elizabeth, he said with stern indignation in his voice. My family's title and fortune mean nothing to me now. I have made a name and place for myself in Wiltshire. Come with me, my dear Elizabeth. This time, her tears of anguish transformed into tears of happiness. Yet, afraid of what she was hearing, and afraid that all could be taken from her again, Elizabeth needed clarity. What did you say? She inquired. Arthur took her hands in his and closed what little space lay between them. Come with me, Elizabeth, to Downton and be my wife. I promise I will never let time come between us again. Elizabeth nodded as her eyes fell onto Arthur's lips. She had kissed them once but could not recall what it felt like. As if sensing her thoughts, Arthur leaned in and claimed her mouth. It was a soft yet hungry kiss, and Elizabeth welcomed the sensation. As she draped her arms securely around Arthur's middle, Elizabeth vowed to follow him wherever he should go. This time, she would not be left behind. I am no longer a child of 15. Arthur paced his room as he prepared a speech for his father. This time, as he faced the Earl, Arthur was prepared for the consequences. He would choose to lose his family's name and fortune over the love of his life. When he entered his father's study, what he saw left him speechless before the blood boiled in his veins. His father was red in the face, his hands on his throat, and Henry was standing behind the old man. The older brother was attempting to strangle and murder their father. Arthur grabbed at the bottle of port from near the fireplace and lunged for his brother, aiming for the man's head. A loud crash exploded and Arthur tumbled to the ground. Yet, he was not the only body that fell, as the other two tumbled beside him. Getting to his feet, Arthur grabbed for his father and pulled the man away. The Earl gasped for air, grunting and choking. Before them, Henry lay curled on the ground, cradling his bleeding head. You fool! Henry barked at him. This is our business you are meddling with. Why did you have to return home? How is killing father a business affair? Arthur snarled, stepping in between the Earl and his brother, his jaw tense and his fists tightening. He was ready to fight the brother whom he never feared. Henry has learned of his disinheritance and disownment, the Earl said in a weak voice from behind him. With his mounting debts, I have had to clear it with his inheritance and send him to the continent. There, he can start fresh. And no one will save him should he continue in his ways. How am I to survive on my own? Henry whimpered, still cradling his wound. Your brother managed in Wiltshire. You may write to him, asking for guidance and support. Be sure to address him as a my lord, the legal heir to Penhaven. Arthur felt his heart flutter. He was the legal heir to Penhaven? Now get out. I never wish to speak to you again. Should you ever step foot onto this estate ever again, I will have you fed to the wolves. Henry glared at Arthur before stumbling out of the room. Arthur followed his brother, ensuring the man did not attempt to return and harm their father. Only after he vanished inside an awaiting carriage and disappeared down the long drive did Arthur return to the library. The old man was pouring himself some brandy at this point. "Father, we need to send for the physician," Arthur said, approaching the old man. "No, my son. I will be just fine." Arthur did not believe the Earl, whose face had become less and less recognizable with each passing day. "Father, are you ill?" Arthur asked, a question that had been lingering on his tongue. The Earl nodded. "For quite some time now, my boy, but that is to be expected. Which is why I summoned you to return home." The older gentleman made his way to the fire and sat down. "Your mother begged me not to send you away," he said, his words forcing Arthur to freeze. "I believe your absence, my doing, is what killed her? She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Slowly, she withered away. And it was all my fault." The Earl's voice cracked at his last words, and his face fell into his hands. He wept like he had the first day Arthur returned. Not knowing what to do, Arthur approached his father and knelt before him. "You couldn't have foreseen the future," Arthur assured him. "You couldn't have prevented Mother's death. I should have heeded her words. I should have been a better husband and father." The Earl looked at him then, his light blue eyes filled with guilt. "Can you ever forgive me, my son? I did what I thought was right, and in the process I only caused chaos and ruined the family." Never had Arthur thought he'd ever hear the Earl ask for forgiveness. The man who was once so cold and stern was now meek and fragile, just a shadow of himself. The sight of his father in such a state tugged at Arthur's chest. He swallowed. "I forgive you, father." Silence passed between them until the Earl spoke again. "Like your mother, I waited for you to return home, my boy," he said in a small voice. "But I was not the only one. Miss Elizabeth never took on a suitor. I can only imagine that she was waiting for you as well." He was silent for some time. "After your mother died, my world shattered. I took to my work and food to forget the agony. It is possible that you have been living in that same pain longer than I have. And I am ever so sorry, my son." Arthur knew his father spoke of the heartache he inflicted on the boy by sending him away all those years ago. "However, now that you are home, and your brother is bound for the continent, it is only right that you take on the family name after I leave this earth. And it is only right that you take on a wife, even if she is the daughter of new money." There was a twinkle in the Earl's eyes just then. Arthur's ears rang at his father's words. "Father, you. He could not find the word to express how he felt at that exact moment. "You have both my permission and my blessing," said the old man. "Now go to her." When Arthur told the news to Elizabeth and spoke with her father, their wedding plans were arranged almost immediately. The Townsends had been waiting 10 years for this very moment, and Arthur and Elizabeth were married in a nearby chapel in the presence of friends and neighbors. As Arthur peered over at his bride, in her champagne silk gown, it was as if time hadn't come between them. She was still as young and beautiful as ever. Their bond and the love they shared, he knew, was everlasting. Arthur and Elizabeth spent many happy years together as Earl and Countess, proving that while family expectations may build walls, time eventually tears them down. Thank you for listening to Time Everlasting, a Regency romance by Lysa Shimkus.